Okay, that gets us set. Okay, well, Kim, thank you very much for the nice introductions, and JC for your excellent presentation on the EU, including looking across the Atlantic a little bit and pointing some criticisms at U.S. foreign policies. I'm happy to be here to participate in this discussion with more focus on the U.S. policies. I'm particularly pleased to be doing this work with my friend and colleague Karl Zuloff, whose flight unfortunately was canceled this morning, and it's a contingency we hadn't planned on. So he's unfortunately not here. He's here in spirit, however, because one of his students here, Joseph Schultz, is here representing the state of Ohio, he says. Joseph is also the chief economist for the Senate Agriculture Committee and a former student of Karl's. That gives you some idea of Karl's scope and interests. He's a marketing and agricultural policy professor at Ohio State and a core contributor to the Farm Docs Daily that Kim mentioned as an extremely good resource both for policy analysts such as ourselves, but also for the agricultural community who are going to be making a lot of decisions for better or for worse under these new programs that the Congress has endorsed. So also just in a sense of being a student, I've really been a student of Karl's on this farm bill. I've worked on farm bills for quite a while, but this particular one I really have been a student of Karl. And I'm also very pleased to have with us here today Ann Krieger, who is a former professor at the University of Minnesota and a tour de force of economic thinking for many decades, certainly the most influential professor for my graduate program in terms of my thinking and the work I've done subsequently. So, Ann, it's a pleasure to have you here. Well, you know, we've had an intense farm bill debate, and it finally resulted this year in passage of the Agricultural Act of 2014. And the debate was conditioned on the one hand by recessionary macroeconomic circumstances and partisan debate over fiscal policy, taxes, entitlements, strategies for economic growth. And on the other hand, by quite prosperous times for agriculture, which were marked by high prices and revenue, but also by a fair bit of volatility in prices and revenue, which gave farm groups a basis for arguing that there was a lot of uncertainty out there and they needed more support despite the prosperous times that they were under. The final bill has a projected 10-year expenditures of about $1 trillion. 3/4 of that is on nutrition assistance for low-income households. That's an important coalition in terms of getting these bills through Congress. Today, we're going to focus on the agricultural support provisions, and we have two objectives. One is to give a brief synopsis of a very complicated set of support provisions that are in this farm bill. Farm bills are always complicated. This one is particularly complicated. And then to give some analysis of possible cost of the 2014 Farm Bill. We were going to split the presentation, myself the first one, and Karl the second. I'll try and cover his part as well, given the circumstances. Now, it's a tall order to cover all this in 15 or 20 minutes, and a lot of points are going to have to wait for the discussion, for elaboration, and even in the slides you'll see that I'm going to skip around among major points quite a bit. Okay, so how can we systematically think about this, this new farm bill? And I think the first point is to say that it really is a shift back, as John Kristof has sort of characterized U.S. policy, to the counter-cyclical historical roots of the U.S. policy instruments. Now, this has two key components. One is we've actually given up these fixed direct payments. Our fixed direct payments were about $5 billion a year. The EU's fixed direct payments are now about 40 billion euros a year. But those were eliminated. Now that implies some certain budget savings, but in exchange for that, what farm groups were arguing for, and the Congress did accommodate them on, was to increase their protection against periods of low prices or declining revenue. And that's what the farm groups were looking for after this period of relative prosperity, but a fair bit of volatility, uncertainty. Now, at the time the bill was passed, the Congressional Budget Office scored it that about 80% of the savings from program elimination would be retained in the bill by expected expenditures over the next 10 years. It's a 5-year bill, but they scored over 10 years. And it now looks like 2014 is going to be quite an expensive year, potentially an expensive year relative to those projections a few months ago when the bill was passed. Well, one of the pillars of U.S. farm support is crop insurance. I'm just going to make 2 points here. Crop insurance, as you can see, was fairly modest cost in the early 2000s, but in the last 3 years jumped up above these fixed direct payments, which were the other major part of support in a period of relatively high prices. 2012, the $13 billion of net insurance payments to farmers, that was the drought year that drove prices up but led to large losses on some farms. Now, the only other point I'm going to make about crop insurance, given the limited time, is that in Carl and my estimation, U.S. crop insurance is over-subsidized, even if you accept, and some people do and some people don't, that there's some sort of systemic risk rationale for public intervention. Now, beyond the crop insurance, which was strengthened a bit in the Farm Bill, what were farmers asking for and what did they get? Well, they were asking for two kinds of risk protection. One was coverage of shallow losses, which was the deductible that wasn't covered by insurance programs that operate within each production year. And the second was for stronger protection against multi-year periods of declining prices or revenue. Now, whatever you think of these calls for additional public support, the reality is that the Congress did concede to these calls for additional protection in exchange for giving up the direct payments. So there are three programs that were set up into this Farm Bill. First, to address the shallow losses. One is an insurance add-on, so it's the supplemental insurance coverage option, and the other is a moving average revenue insurance program. So you set a benchmark of revenue that moves over time, but in any particular year when revenue drops, it's set up to capture some of these shallow losses. So both of these can be discussed as shallow loss programs. The supplemental crop insurance is only a shallow loss within your program, but the agricultural risk coverage also spills over to covering multiple years because this benchmark moves with the market. It's based on 5-year moving average. So it does come down if prices and revenue come down, but it takes a few years to do that, and in between you get this support. Now, the other multi-year program is the more traditional price support program with a fixed reference price, fixed for the period of the whole Farm Bill, and these prices were raised substantially higher than they were in the 2008 Farm Bill. And these prices will now trigger what are called countercyclical payments. Now, we had originally thought that we would cover these details here and Carl would come back with some examples. In the interest of time and with him not here, I'm going to go into the details of this when we do the examples, which will really fix in your mind some of the trade-offs between these programs, both from a public policy point of view and from a farmer decision point of view, because they have to choose one of these programs to enroll in. Well, you can't do a synopsis of the U.S. Farm Bill without talking a little bit about conservation. Conservation has, ever since the 1930s, been closely tied to the commodity programs, both as a supply control measure and for the actual conservation and environmental benefits. This 2014 Farm Bill, despite the high prices, conservation remains a focus, in particular the long-run conservation reserve program, which takes land out of production for long periods, pays farmers to do that. We ended that kind of program in the 1960s and the 1970s when prices went up, in the 1950s and the 1970s when prices went up. This time we didn't end that program. And in addition, conservation compliance, that is certain practices farmers have to follow, was made an eligibility criteria for the crop insurance premium subsidies for the first time. So some wins for the conservation environmental focus, a little bit smaller budget. Now, I'm going to characterize the last two slides in the general overview. I'm going to try to I put it sort of partly for expediency as WTO issues. The first set has to do with two commodity programs that were changed substantially. The cotton program, remember, was challenged in the Brazilian U.S. cotton case, and the U.S. lost that case in the number of dimensions. And ever since then, there's been a sort of waiting for the U.S. to change its program to come into compliance with the WTO dispute settlement rulings. Now, the traditional cotton programs are eliminated in this Farm Bill. So there's no ARC or PRC, these new programs for cotton, whereas traditionally they've had the same programs as the other supported crops. Now, in place of that, cotton gets a highly subsidized insurance program, something like this SCO option I just mentioned. Now, this is intended to bring the U.S. into compliance with WTO ruling. The CBO projects a 10-year cost of $3.3 billion. But again, as an insurance program, this cost could be higher or lower. So we will see whether this, in fact, is viewed as bringing the U.S. into compliance with the WTO rulings. Now, the second commodity that has received a major change in its program is dairy. We used to have a traditional price support program for dairy. That's also been eliminated. And in place of that, the dairy sector is getting a margin protection program, a new kind of insurance instrument, which ensures revenue versus cost. So it's ensuring that margin. Now that's a potentially fairly distorting kind of margin to insure. So this is a one to watch because this is slipping into this new farm bill, first with dairy. It's also been authorized for rice for next year. So this may be something where the farm lobby sees an opportunity to create new instruments and create new support from the government. So what's something to watch? Now it will affect our the way we notify dairy support to the WTO. Those of you who know those arcane rules know that that's an issue. And the other way to think about this is suppose you get a trade liberalization. I mean, think about a trade liberalization. You would potentially have U.S. dairy prices coming down as we remove some of our protection, potentially grain prices going up as we have more grain exporting opportunities around the world, and that would put a squeeze on exactly this margin that the dairy farmers have insurance to protect them on. Now there are larger WTO issues, and there's really just three major points to make. The first is that there is very little WTO discipline on this 2014 Farm Bill. We did not get a Doha round agreement that was going to dampen down, substantially dampen down the support allowed by developed countries. And so in the absence of that, we still have the very sort of liberal, loose, if you will, WTO maximum expenditure for certain types of support. The second reason there's not very much discipline is the SCO, the PLC, and the ARC, these new programs will probably be notified as non-product specific support as opposed to product specific support. And the example I'll give in a minute, the next slide, will demonstrate to you why the U.S. gets away, so to speak, with notifying that way. That means that those expenditures don't count against our WTO limit of $19 billion unless the summed expenditures on non-product specific support exceed 5% of the total value of U.S. agricultural production over $300 billion. So, you know, $15 billion, $20 billion is the 5%. If you go over that, all of that dumps into being counted against your support measure. So if you go over that, the U.S. could all of a sudden be looking like reporting a lot of support to the WTO. Now, low prices will renew scrutiny because of this price linkage and revenue linkage. They will renew scrutiny of the U.S. programs in the WTO. And with these higher PLC reference prices, I don't want to overemphasize this, but it is possible that the U.S. would in fact exceed the non-product specific de minimis. I mean, that would be really quite remarkable. But the total PLC payments, if you look at the legislation, the losses they cover, if all crops fell to the minimum prices for that crop, then these payments would exceed $30 billion. And that would potentially, you can see there's potential then for exceeding the 5% of de minimis threshold in the WTO. Now I'll remind you that $30 billion is a huge amount of money, but it's less than the EU is spending on support for its farmers at this time. Per year. This will be in a year. And again, it's because of these higher prices. Now finally, I think you can see from these points that enactment of this bill in an environment where there was no Doha agreement and therefore no WTO tightening disciplines on what the U.S. might think about doing, in turn then makes it much more difficult to negotiate tighter disciplines in the future. Well, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but okay, I've got 2 minutes. It's going to take 4, so let me take 4. let me give these examples that Carl was going to give to really drive home how complicated this is, but also what some of the trade-offs are. So let's look at 2014 first. First thing is that ARC and PLC, these new programs, but having some traditional roots, the payments only occur on a fixed base of acres. So this is 71.7 million acres for corn, it looks like. Now that's a fixed number, which means that you're not really tied directly to planting of corn this year. You can grow any crop you want. Once you've established it as corn-based, you get this payments as corn-based, even if you're growing soybeans or wheat. So that is a certain kind of decoupling of the payments from incentive for production of specific crops. So they become, in a certain sense, a kind of contingent income support payment that's not so different as it might first sound from the income support payments the EU is making. They're contingent on these price movements, but they are income transfers, not marginal support for your production at every bushel and every acre. Now the PLC reference price is raised to $3.70. It used to be $2.63, so a 41% increase. The range of prices over which this program would make payments is deep, would cover any difference between $3.70, $1.90, and $1.95. $1.95 is a very minimal price support level that a different part of the farm legislation guarantees farmers as an incentive for every acre. Every bushel. We have not seen prices below that loan rate since the year 2000. So no one's really expecting corn to go down to $1.95, but that is the bottom rung of this safety net, and these programs we're describing work on top of that rung. The yield is also fixed. You don't get payments on all of your yield, even on the base acres. It's a fixed amount of acres. It's 131 bushels under the new Farm Bill. So the range of PLC payments comes from zero if the price is over $3.70 to $16 billion just for corn if prices fell all the way down to the loan rate, a long ways down from where we are. Another way of thinking it, every 10 cents below $3.70 costs taxpayers about $0.9 billion. Yeah. Almost $1 billion. All right, the ARC program is a little bit different. The 5-year moving average of yields is 150 bushels. The ARC price component, 5-year moving average of prices over these high price period we've had, is 532 a bushel. The revenue benchmark is the multiplication of those two, almost $800 an acre. The payment range, however, is limited to if your revenue falls 14% to 86% of the benchmark, payments start. Falls to 76%, you get full payment to there. Go below 76%, you don't get any payments, because crop insurance, other programs in principle are kicking in on your safety net as the farmers perceive it. So that means the range of prices of a revenue is $603 to $683, and the range of total ARC payments is 0 to almost $6 billion. Now, let's look at for 2014, and I'll finish with these slides and not do the conclusions, because I think the conclusions really just recapture sort of the things I've been saying. All right, so let's look at 2014. The top of the slide just repeats those key parameters. Here's the USDA long-run projection projection for 2014 from February of 2014, so for this coming crop year. 162 bushels, $3.65 for the price. This is an example Vince Smith has used in this ICTSD paper that was just mentioned. Very nice paper about the new Farm Bill. This gives a revenue of $591. It's below the 76% of the benchmark revenue. You get the full ARC payments. The price of $3.65 is just slightly below the target price for the PLC program, the reference price, so you get a $500 million payments. ARC looks expensive. Here's Zulauf Orden, and really Carl Zulauf's. Look at the current market, about 164 bushels anticipated yield, price of $3.80. The revenue is higher, which means the ARC payments come down to $4.3 billion. The price is over $3.70. The PLC pays nothing. Now remember, farmers are going to have to choose between these programs at the end of 2014. So they'll know kind of what happened in 2014, not what's going to happen for the remaining 4 years. Now what if you get a really high price, low yield scenario? 175 bushels, which is being speculated as possible record-breaking yields this year. Price falls, just for an example, to $3. The revenue goes down. The ARC payments go back up to their maximum. Now, PLC looks, ARC looks costly, PLC less costly, but could cost more, because if you get the $3 price, you're talking about almost $7 billion of PLC payments. Now, let's look quickly at, and this will be the last slide, at 2018. Now let's suppose, just to give an illustration, that the price just stays and the yield just stays without interruption at the level of those two last examples, the 164, $3.80, or the 175, $3. Well, the ARC benchmark over those 5 years comes to settle on those rates. So the benchmark revenue is $623. No change in yields or prices. The actual revenue is $623, and ARC payments come down to 0. Now, in that case, again, you're over the $3.70 reference price for the PLC, and you also get 0 PLC payments. But if you get this low price scenario, the $3 price, well, first of all, there is a bit of fixity in the ARC program. This was a big debate in Congress, but the reference prices are the minimum prices that the price component of revenue is allowed to drop to into the ARC. So you get the $3.70 price, even though the market price is $3, as your ARC price component. You see it pushes the revenue up a bit, and you're above the actual revenue at the price of $3. You get about $2.3 billion of ARC payments, but again, the PLC is at the $7 billion. So Both of these programs, again, I started by saying no matter what you think of these programs, I'm not particularly favorably inclined towards disuse of taxpayer money or that it's good for global agricultural trade liberalization or modern agricultural sectors. But if you look at these programs, these are decisions farmers are going to have to make on the one hand, choosing between these options with imperfect information. That's what makes a complicated job for Joe Schultz. And the other hand, you know, the implications for the public support for agriculture, which become much more, the safety net truly has been strengthened, somewhat in the way the safety net was strengthened in the late 1970s when agricultural prices were up. And then, of course, we got a very strong deflationary period in the early 1980s, and that brought these prices crashing down against these raised supports. If we get a period of relatively low prices, we are going to be back into that kind of environment of large public expenditures, controversy about farm programs, challenges arising in the WTO. I'll stop there.